I'm Philip Lutgendorf. I translate pre-modern Hindi poetry and write on Bollywood cinema and assorted other things. But the topic is really intercultural communication. David Sanford has written a very interesting, very practical book intended to particularly help people from India, people from the subcontinent, communicate with Americans, and as you rightly say, U.S. Americans, because there are other kinds of Americans. Yes, here's the book. It's called Spilling the Beans. And I just want to, I'm going to really turn it over to you, but I'll just want to say, when I was a Hindi student in India back in 1979, one of the things that our teachers would our main teacher would regularly do is she would talk about, and she would use the English word, cultural point. She would say, ye cultural point hai. This is a cultural point. And we learned many very important and interesting things in this way, such as not saying thank you all the time in India, because people don't, as you point out in your book, Americans constantly say thank you for all sorts of things. And in India, it's just not done. You don't, when someone gives you change in a store, you don't thank them, because it makes them uncomfortable, because that's what they're supposed to do. And another thing we learned was to not go around gushing compliments like, ooh, what a beautiful dress you're wearing. It invites the evil eye, and it makes people very uncomfortable. So anyway, intercultural communication is a real issue, and it's particularly important today with so much business being done between Indians and Americans. So, what prompted you to write this book?
Nice to see you all. I was changing planes, and I think it was Chicago. I went to the food court, and I saw what I thought was an Indian, so I sat next to him. And we started talking, and one thing led to another, and he said, oh, that's interesting what you do. And he said, very interesting. So as an Indian, what advice would you give me for working with these Americans? And I, frankly, really don't remember what I said, but I said a couple of things, and he looked at me and he said, that's really interesting. I've got to catch a plane. You should write a book. His name was Raj, and I have him in dedication. And so the book is dedicated to Raj, wherever he is, because he was the impetus. And it was like, oh, that's interesting, because I also found it fascinating that he had been in this country for 10 years doing business with us. And I just, off the cuff, put out a couple of things which he really said was interesting. So I felt he was right. There was a book. So,
why are you targeting Indians as readers? And maybe at this point you could talk a little bit about your own background.
Philip and I have talked about this because we share a love of India and having lived there. So I spent my adolescence in India. So 7th, 8th, 9th, part of 10th grades. So India was in my blood. Came back to this country.
You noticed the jackets.
The jackets. Felt completely a duck out of water. I mean, the music I didn't connect with. It was at a time where nothing like this existed, right? So I didn't watch TV for 4 years. And I survived.
When you say the music, you didn't connect with American music when you came back.
American music. Right. We got connected to the Beatles a year after they had come out. So I was there in 63, 64, so we didn't even know about them until a year afterwards. At any rate, I was a duck out of water. So American, for me, was very strange. I looked American, I spoke American, but I had never been to an American football game. I knew what baseball was. The Indians play basketball. So I was in a conundrum. I didn't know about my own place. So that began my interest in finding out about the United States, which continues to be somewhat of an enigma to me.
I think it is to many of us, especially lately.
These days.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Would you say your book is relevant to non-Indian readers?
Actually, yes. Basically, what I do in this, it's really pretty straightforward. I unwrap the American value system. From my experience in working for the last 20 plus years as a cultural consultant. So much of that in the role of being a bridge, a communication bridge between cultures, I often work with Americans about other cultures. So my premise is that it's important we learn about what this is before we can look out there and see what that is. So if I'm teaching about India, I always begin with a session about what is being American, because this is the contrast you're going to connect with or relate to when you're talking and thinking about what they're like. So that's what the impetus was, to explain the American value system as a way for the Indians primarily to begin to understand how to understand our behaviors.
And I should say that you are a little careful in the beginning to say that you're going to be making a lot of generalizations, but that's not the whole story. And when he talks about the American value system, we all know there are more than one, but you're trying to get at some key repetitive cultural values that are noticed by people from the subcontinent. I remember my Hindi teacher. Now, this is probably less true today, but she had gone to the U.S. once, and it would have been probably in the 70s. And her friends in India had warned her that one of the most disturbing things about the United States, and you're not going to believe this, but the silence.
Really?
Yeah, because if you think about it, think about life in Delhi.
Yeah.
Think about the sounds that you hear all the time on the street. Now, of course, traffic. In those days, there was very little traffic, but there were hawkers, there were
stray dogs.
There were cows, right? And the absence of livestock was also very shocking. Where are they? Did they all die? Yeah, right. Anyway, but culture. What are some key cultural differences in your view that you address in the book that are relevant for doing business today for Indians?
Well, to finish answering your question before, the reviews I've gotten so far is that the chapters, which are very simple to read, are about 4, which basically unwrap the American values. So those are relevant for any of us, any culture, anybody trying to understand the United States. However, a lot of the examples I give are all for my Indian readers. So those may not be as understandable to you, but the unwrapping of the values are very much, regardless of where you are.
One of the things you emphasize is being on time. and so when the author liaison asked me outside, have you seen him? I said, don't worry, he's going to be here.
I was out there. I would say, people ask me that, I would say the major contrast that I see all the time, particularly in working with Americans and trying to translate what they can expect in working with their Indian partners, who may be virtual, most of them are virtual, but one of the main areas is the hierarchy. Hierarchy. Think of our American value system. Think of our white ancestors, where they came from. One of the primary values is what's a primary value, if you were to say, as an American, what's a value that comes to your mind, which is an American, that every one of us in this room could agree on? Pardon? Equality? Excellent. Okay, excellent. Pardon? Yes. Yeah.
Equality as an ideal.
Yeah, as an ideal. We're still working out the details of that one. I would say equality. So from that, a contrast to that in India, you're looking at a culture of easily 5,000 years with the basis of which a caste system was very much part of how you distinguished the different tradespeople, different people in a village, and it's true to this day. So with that came a sense of hierarchy, who you show respect to, who you connect with, how you relate to them. And fast forward, translate that in an office environment. I send an email to Sanjeev over here. In this country, when we send an email or text, we pretty much expect to get a response like, what, it's been 90 minutes and you're not responding to me? What's happening with you? So the email is going to take a long time, and when it goes over there, it goes to Sanjeev, but it's going to go up to his boss or whomever, someone above him, before he can really feel he can respond to me. So it's going to be delayed communication, and it's going to go up the chain because that's what matters. So in India these days, 67% of businesses are still owned by families. Now, these might be multi-billion-dollar businesses, but they're a family that owns this, and the hierarchy is very clearly a triangle. And there's one person on top, typically a male, but it could be a woman, and that's where the decision goes. So this American says, gosh, I'm working with Rajiv here in my office, and, you know, I keep wanting, I just say, hey, just tell me what you think. Well, Rajiv is not used to thinking on his own or used to putting out somewhere else. So I would say of the contrast, equality and hierarchy is a huge one that has ramifications in all sorts of the way we communicate with each other.
And you encourage Indian workers to express themselves, to be forthright, to which and you're right. I mean, people have great reluctance, particularly in a tiered system, to take that kind of, put themselves on the line like that.
And you think of it, our kids in this country, from day one, what do you think? Do you want Wheaties or Cheerios? Which is it? We're constantly encouraging them to, A, make a decision and to talk to us about that decision. Whereas most Indians and Indian families are not given that type of freedom. You follow a route, you follow the family, you follow rules. And so they come here and you give them a choice of decisions or whatever, and there's usually a gap there because they're not used to expressing themselves in the way that Americans and many Westerners are.
But do you think, I mean, given the changes that have happened, which you and I have both witnessed in the last few decades, I mean, the extraordinary changes, especially in the metros, in urban India. Do you still think this is as true? The explosion of consumer culture, the explosion of the internet and cell phone communication.
That's a great question. You go to a back village in India, and I've been to many. An old man there who can hardly see, but he's got a little cricket phone, right? So the technology is gone there, but in terms of bottom line value system, I was first in India in the mid-'60s, and I've been back 50 times, or however many times, and there's a heart of Indian culture which I have seen that has not changed. You know, when I ask a fellow here, his name is Luv, L-U-V, and he's working for an American company in the East Coast. I was there doing some consulting, teaching about how to work with Americans. And let's see, Indian values. I said, look, and this is a guy that speaks English very well, has been here, has an American girlfriend, right? So you know he's...
Anglo-American girlfriend.
Anglo-American girlfriend. So I said, and at the end of the training session, I said, bottom line, Luv, what's the Indian value that really is in your heart? This is a modern Indian. What's most important to Indians is God, one's parents, teachers, and then oneself. In that order, as my friend Luv told me when I asked him what he thought were the most significant Indian values. So at the heart, the modernity has come there as it is to most of the world. But the heart of that value system, I feel, is very much intact and very similar to the one that I experienced as a Chota Baba, as a child growing up in India.
Although again, of course, he may be expressing ideals also.
That's
you
true.
know,
That's true.
In the way that Americans talk about equality, but
Yeah.
don't necessarily practice it. Yeah.
But you have to remember that in India, the numbers are huge. It's 1.2 plus billion people.
Sure. I think it's 1.3 now.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's 4 times our population in the size of Alaska. Okay? Visualize that for a moment. Extremely, extremely crowded wherever you go.
And
So-
extremely competitive.
Competitive. And of that 1.3, there's probably close to about 400 million which know what this is, connect with this, can speak with us. What that means is that there's also 800 million who are not connected, who have no sense about a larger world, a very, very small sense of a larger world. So the world that I certainly connect with and work with from a corporate point of view is 400 million.
Are you, I would say, you know, the proof is in the pudding, and you do these workshops and seminars and so on, and do you get feedback from the Indian participants that they find it really helpful, really useful? That would be
Yes.
good.
Yes. Yeah.
Then
And
you're
yeah,
doing a service.
Well, hopefully.
Yeah.
And these are typically anywhere from age upper 20s to 30, to upper 20s to 40, 45 that are working in Novartis, pharmaceutical company in New Jersey. They've been over here for a year or two assignment, and they are the ones that I think are finding it most useful. So it confirms that, yes, it's changing. But there's a heart of India that is the same India that I knew from 40, 50 years ago. Yeah.
What insights did you gain from writing the book?
Well, I learned that the editing process is a hell of a process to go through. I would say the American values, I really, really researched it. There's a chapter in here where I basically talk about history, our history, very perfunctorily, very, very, I survey it and connect how that value of equality came in with the first generation of Americans, Europeans. And I think the American value system really began to make more sense to me in going through this exercise.
So you sort of learn about yourself by trying to look at yourself through the eyes of another, in this case, someone from India.
Yeah, very much so.
Good. We have time for questions, if there are questions out there. Yeah.
Nancy.
David and friend. I was thinking about one of the main differences between American.
Speak into the mic.
Sorry.
Please.
One of the big differences between the U.S. American culture and many cultures, even some of our historically connected Northern European white cultures, is this focus on individuality.
Yes.
Which seems a lot of times to supersede equality. And the fact that Indians have this connected, defined role in some way that's not based on individuality, that is really admirable in some ways, not a backward thing.
Yeah. Well,
do you want to say anything?
Well, yeah, the notion of individuality in the field of cross-cultural communication, which has developed primarily over the last 40 years, there are actually scales. There's an attempt the PhDs of our field have come up with all sorts of studies in the last 30 years. And one of them is based on the study of individuality. How do you measure that? And there are all these scales of countries, 70, 80 different countries in the world. Individuality for the United States, it's like up here on the scale, and the next countries of the Scandinavian countries are also that way, but it's way down here. We far exceed anyone in terms of individuality. So when we talk about freedom in this country, you know, that's one of the words that comes up when I have that exercise, what are American values? Freedom is another value that comes up very, very quickly. And I will usually say, you mean individual freedom? And they say, yes, to do what I want, whenever I want.
Yeah, but I also want to emphasize that he's not making value judgments about these values.
Yeah.
He's simply trying to help people communicate and function in a pragmatic situation cross-culturally. So he's not saying that the Indian emphasis on family and group is bad.
Yeah, there's no.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's no. But but it's individuality in this country is huge. Huge. It's me versus us.
I haven't read your book, but what advice do you give to people in India to work with individuals, people who are so individualistic here?
Yeah, not be afraid to ask questions. You know, what would you? How do you think? To lean into their shyness about saying what's on their minds, which is something that most Indians, in my experience, are hesitant to do unless you really get to know them. So.
And you also point out that it's a tendency to be agreeable and to commit yourself to things that actually you may not be able to do, and that's then looked upon very badly in this country. If you don't do something, you don't deliver by the deadline, you lose credibility, and you can't just be a yes person all the time. You have to sometimes say no.
There's a couple of different chapters where I just say, if you want to be successful with most Americans, these are some tips you might want to lean into.
So when you're dealing with technical companies, how do you address the sort of one of my experiences, which is that in a lot of American cultures, knowledge is negotiated and relative, whereas in a lot of South Asia, knowledge is delivered and factored and sort of built up. And I would imagine that in kind of a lot of these technical companies, that would be a real balancing point.
Yeah, I think it's connected to the hierarchy value. That it's just, this is it. This is the information. This is what you should accept, and with very little discussion.
Yeah, I would say what you just said is essentially it's one of the things he writes about and talks about. And I think that maybe explains why a lot of Indian scientists and engineers have come to this country and been incredibly successful and have blossomed in ways that I think some of them would say they might not have been able to do back home because they would have been held down by layers of superiors and fixed ways of doing things that held them back. Does that fit with your experience, Marcus? Or?
It fits a bit with my experience, some of it being the hierarchy, but some of it being really a question of negotiating knowledge, and the fact that I remember a fellow I knew who went to MIT, and he was given a problem set in his first thing there, and it needed the density. You needed to have the density of stone to figure it out, and that wasn't in the information given. And he worked on it for a week, and finally he went to the professor in the office hours and asked, "How do I do this? I don't have the density of stone." And the guy said, "What do you think it is? Figure it out." And there was this. You know, it wasn't really just the hierarchy. It was the question of, you know, you're given the fact there is an ultimate truth, whereas with a lot of this is a lot of the other approaches to knowledge, you build it up, you assemble facts, and that there isn't a right answer. It's a negotiated process.
Yeah. Well, that's an interesting point, because that's called thinking outside of the box. And again, in the American system, in many Western systems, we are trained from day one to do that. What do you think? How far would you take this? You're talking in Asia, all throughout Asia, in my experience, much of the world, it's a rote memorization system. You combine that with a hierarchy, asking questions is not reinforced.
Yeah.
At all. And I find that true to this day of these Indians that may be here in, Edison, New Jersey, working for whomever. That becomes one of the issues that I consult with a lot, of that kind of issue. Well, yes, when I work with them, but they don't ask questions. So you've hit on a very, very important point that certainly one that I dance with all the time. And so, yes, India's changed, and again, maybe not. And again...
Well, and primary and secondary education is unquestionably dominated by a fixed curriculum and rote memorization.
Yeah.
And in all but the most elite, super elite, nonconformist schools, of which there are some, but not many. Are we out of time? Well, thank you all for coming.
Thank you, David,
again.
Philip, so much. Thank you all for coming. I'm sorry, this is a short session.